So the foundation of the build was a 5x8 utility trailer, very much the same one that you would buy at like a Tractor Supply or Home Depot. So what I decided to do is to leave the black side rails, the vertical side rails up, and build the tub, which I'm doing here in this portion out of 3/4 inch plywood. The tub will actually slide into the trailer, and the rest of the camper is built off of that. In a few moments, that will become a little bit more clear. So as you guys can see there, that's the mock-up. Those are the sides. And I left those rails on and decided to build the trailer up from that to give it a little bit more clearance on the sides. Now, to drop some of the weight of the trailer, I'm actually pulling out all of the 2x6s that were at the bottom of the trailer. I approximated that was probably about 200 pounds of wood. It was quite a lot. Now, sometime previous, I had actually cut out or took off the back ramp of the trailer. So here I'm making, I call it the tub. Essentially, it's kind of like an open top box. I'm just using some pocket hole screws. This is 3/4 ply. It's just like a utility ply. I didn't really worry about how it looked cosmetically so much because, as you guys will see, this will be all covered up. The pocket hole screws make it real convenient just to install the sides. I use some glue, as you guys could see there, and it will be plenty strong, especially when I apply the PMF later. I really like this construction method. It really made it easy as opposed to trying to build it out from the trailer itself. But more importantly, it allows the main camper part to actually be removed from the trailer if I so wanted. One thing that you see here is the front portion of the camper will actually extend over the front of the trailer here. Now you guys see I cut it at an angle. My original thought was to build a slightly different front shape, but you'll see that I'll cut that off straight a little bit later. So I talked about PMF. It's commonly known as poor man's fiberglass. It's a pretty old technique, and there's a couple variations of it. But here what I'm using is Titebond 2 glue, which is important, and canvas. This is just a basic utility canvas. I just bought it off Amazon. It would be like a drop cloth canvas. And you basically spread the glue out, lay the canvas out over it, and then put glue on top and let it dry. And then I painted it black using a bed liner product called Herculiner. Of course, you could use an outdoor grade paint, something like that. So now I'm cutting the cedar into strips for what will be the frame. Now this cedar I basically just sourced from fence pickets that I bought at my local home store, specifically Lowe's in my case. I cut them down. These come in 6-foot lengths. I planed them down to 1/2 inch using a thickness planer, and now I'm just ripping them down to 1.5 inches wide. And you'll see in a second that I'm going to laminate these together. In other words, glue them together to form the frame. And what this will allow me to do is it allows me to make sure all the boards are straight, but it will allow me to make a joinery, kind of like a mortise and tenon joinery, to connect all of the frame pieces together. So when I glue them together, basically I'll just use Titebond 2 glue, and then I'll use brad nails to hold them together. And in some cases, as you saw, I use clamps to actually compress them. This might be a little confusing at this point, but you guys will see in a moment what I'm talking about. So, just using a thickness planer, I just used my table saw to rip them down. Here's a little close-up of how I'm laminating together. You see, if you look on the end, you see there's that gap in the middle. Well, that will be important in a few moments because that's going to allow for some classic joinery. You guys can see some examples of that right there. And I'm just using that cordless brad nailer, 18 gauge, just to stack them together. Then I clamp them together to make sure they're straight. So here we're putting up the frame. So those upright members, or the columns, are actually attached to what I call the wing section, or the section of the tub, which I was discussing earlier, that will extend over the side of the camper. So those were just attached from underneath, just driving screws up from underneath. And now see the beams that cross over? Those beams actually slide into the gap in the center of those laminated boards, so it forms some classic joinery. I'll try to show you guys a picture of that here in a moment. And this is just, it's, this video is a quick primer here. There's a lot to this, but, I'm just using brad nails to attach everything, and the joinery technique that I talked about with glue. I didn't even really use that many screws. I might have used a screw here and there if I really wanted to tie something down, but most of it's just the glue, the brad nails, and the joinery that's formed from laminating the boards together and using key spaces. Now, from a dimensional standpoint, the overall width of this camper is 77 inches wide, and it was 101 inches long. Now, of course, if you build your own, you could adjust the length. Now, you guys notice that I staggered the height of those beam sections, and the reason is becoming clear right here. That's 1/4-inch plywood. Now, what I did is I cut it down a little bit, so when 2 sheets are placed in position like that, it makes a total width. But I attach it down at the bottom and actually compressed the plywood over the top like that to form that front curvature that you guys see in the camper. I call it a compression arch. I'm not sure if that's a technical term or not, but what that does is you guys just intuitively know that if you bend plywood like that, it actually makes it strong. Now, what I'm using to attach it on the top there is actually construction adhesive. I just use PL3 specifically. I like it because sometimes it's a little hard to get an extremely tight fit there. So using that construction adhesive gives me a little bit of flexibility. Now, because these sheets of plywood only come in dimensional widths of 48 inches, of course I had to cut 2, and there's going to be a seam in the middle. And what you guys will see in a moment is I actually took 1/4-inch plywood and cut it down to strips that was about 2.5 inches wide. And from the inside of the camper, I'll actually glue those strips in place, and that will add some extra strength. So here I am cutting those strips. You guys can see those right there. Just ripping them down with a table saw. See them stacking them up right there. And that will come into play in a moment. So what helps keep this camper light is that the front portion of the frame is actually made up of that compression arc with that 1/4-inch plywood. And then when I skin it or attach the sidewalls with cedar planking, that will form the strength. So there is some frame members made from cedar, but I'm also using the strength of that compression arch plus kind of the wall strength, which is kind of like an exoskeleton in some sense. Now right now what I'm doing is I'm pinning pieces of wood up underneath, and that will serve as an attachment point later for the outside skin. So right here is where I'm going to fill in that seam. So I'm just mixing up some fiberglass Bondo. That's a Bondo product, but it has some little fiberglass resin, little fiberglass hairs in it. And I'm just filling in that, kind of almost like if you were going to paint a car and you're fixing a dent or something. And I'll sand it down smooth. Now, I will be applying PMF, or that poor man's fiberglass, over the front of this, as you guys can see. So I'm not too worried about the finish being perfect, but I try to want to make it look a little nicer. Now, that lower edge down there that you see of that plywood was actually screwed to the tub. So I was filling in some of those screw holes. And then, there was some other screw holes along the side there. Now, what you guys see here is I'm stretching over the canvas. Now, I was able to get one complete 15-foot section that was also 10 foot or 10 foot wide. So I was able to use one entire continuous sheet of canvas. And as you guys saw, I rolled out the glue, placed the canvas and stretched it to the top, put another coat of glue on that. Now, look right here. See those strips that are glued on the inside? That's what I was talking about cutting that plywood into strips. So I glued it on the inside to cover up that seam, as you see right there, and on the sides. And that added a little bit of strength, but it'll also add a standoff later for when I do the interior. Now, the interior of this camper, before I put on the sidewalls, I'm just using some outdoor grade paint. This was just some Oops paint that I picked up on sale. And I'm painting all of the plywood surfaces. And that's basically, it has a cosmetic effect, but most importantly, that's just going to give it some protection against the elements if there was any condensation inside, or say, for example, on the floor section here. I'll have some other flooring too, but if I were to spill some water or something like that. Now, of course, this doesn't need to be waterproof to the level that the outside of it would need to be for, rain or snow or something. But you guys can see how that roof curves around. So the compression arc in the front, and then I pulled the two rear pieces of plywood into place, like as you guys saw right there, and that makes the little arc in the rear. Now what I'm covering the outside with, you want to give it 24 hours for that PMF to fully dry, is I'm just using some outdoor grade paint. I'm just using an off-white color right here. And I'm just rolling it on. It makes it really easy, something that's really accessible to everybody. And as you guys will see, it turns out pretty darn good. The yellow you see there is that color of that glue when it finally dries. So you guys can see I'm just using a roller here. And this is just the outdoor grade paint. And the combination of the canvas embedded with the glue and then the outdoor grade paint on the outside provides a very durable, waterproof finish. And then the canvas provides a layer of thickness that holds everything together. Now, one thing I wanted to discuss is where that canvas rolled over the edge. I actually stapled it to those edge pieces that ran along the side, which is also the same point where the cedar siding will come into place. So these are just those fence pickets. Again, I'm just running them through a thickness planer, planing them down to half an inch. It's a lot of work. It's a little tedious, but it comes together. And this will make up the cedar that you see on the sidewalls of the camper. A lot of cedar shavings, as you guys can imagine. Now, the way that these boards fit over each other is this is actual wood, so it's going to expand and contract with the elements. So what I'm creating there is a lap joint, which is where I will actually cut a 1/4 inch down on one side and a 1/4 inch side on the other side, and then the boards will actually have an ability to slide over each other. Now here, what you guys saw was a really key element. I used adhesive caulking. It's basically, I use the DAP brand Dynaflex caulking, and I actually use that in combination with 18 gauge brad nails to attach these cedar boards over the top of each other. And that caulking serves two roles. At first, it serves as an adhesive. It's not a technical adhesive, but when it dries, I'm sure if you guys have worked with caulking, you see that it actually is a pretty good adhesive. But it's also flexible, which is absolutely key, because you need to have a mechanism for those boards to be able to flex to each other or across each other. That's really, really key, or otherwise you'll get splits in the side. It's a little bit tedious, but you just build board on board, starting from the top or from the bottom and going all the way to the top. Now, getting around that curve will be a little bit tedious, but I think you guys could see how strong this is, because those are 1/2 inch pieces of cedar. They're very light, but they're still robust enough to provide kind of the sidewall itself, not just blocking it in, but really, really strong. Now, what you guys just saw there is I had framed out the window, and then I just overlapped some of those cedar boards a little bit and used a flush cut router bit to cut that hole for the window. And then the window will later be installed. That's just a traditional acrylic RV window. And here we go on the other side, just using those lap joints, the Dynaflex Ultra caulking, 18 gauge brad nail, and just nailing those in place. I don't really use screws on the side. I never really found it necessary. I might run a few here and there if I want to make sure the board's really held down, or I want to place it in a position to where the board can't move. But for the most part, I'm just using 1.5" 18 gauge brad nails. Once you get all the sidewalls in, you just go through and you sand it smooth. You don't need to sand a ton. I usually only go down to about 120 grit. Those circular holes you see there will be for small porthole windows, which I'll install later. But remember those pieces of wood on the 1/4" plywood that made up that roof that I was attaching from underneath? Well, those cedar boards actually attached that and overlapped. Coat of the finish on there. I did not get time-lapse of it, but I did shoot a live of me putting the coating on there, and you can actually go to my channel and watch that if you want to. But this is the finish I'm using. This is the PPG Prolux transparent satin stain. It's a log and siding wood finish. They have a couple different variations of different finishes. I really like this transition. This is what I was talking about before. The white directly to the wood, no trim. I actually like it. I think it's super clean. Now this first coat, the product requires 2 coats to be for full protection. This first coat is very flat, and if you feel the wood, it doesn't even really feel like there's anything on top of it. It feels like all of the coat, the finish, or at least most of the finish, actually went in. It has to dry for 24 hours, which at this point right now, this is dried for about 24 hours. So I'm actually going to put the second coat on tonight, and I will capture that in a live, which can be viewed on the channel. Now what I also did inside of here is I also applied the same finish to all of the internal cedar surfaces. That way it kind of seals the wood on both sides. And this is just a brush on. You know, largely speaking, it's a pretty easy application. I think the biggest key is, as excited as you may be, which I have been many times, to put multiple coats on in short succession. You got to give it its 24 hours, and just go ahead and back brush every once in a while, just in case you get some drips. Especially sometimes I'll put the brush on in to try to get inside, you know, get finish inside of these cracks, because if you don't, that light tan color will show up pretty noticeably. So sometimes you'll get a little bit of drips there. So just kind of be careful to back brush it, or if you're in areas where, you know, like around the edge of this trim or something where some of the finish could adhere. But all right. All right, so here I'm prepping the trailer for the install of the camper portion. Just cutting off those ends. Those were portions that were meant to lock in place the ramp. Like I said, that whole tub section and the whole camper will slide right in. Now, remember I talked about removing those boards. The whole camper now will actually serve as a rigid structural member to that trailer to make it real rigid and strong. Now, once I slide the camper on, I will screw it in from underneath, and here we go. This is what it looks like. But theoretically, that camper could be removed by removing those screws if a person wanted to. All right, guys, so this video is meant just to be a primer to kind of give you guys a sense of how to build the exterior. If you guys want a more detailed series, go to my channel. I had a whole weekly vlog series for the build of this where I go into a little bit greater detail, and I will link up that playlist at the bottom. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks a bunch.